We have a very special guest tonight, Charlene Liu. But before we jump into that, I just wanted to get into a couple of logistical things since we're here at the midpoint of the semester. I submitted midterm grades, as people probably have seen by now, so just wanted to give you a heads up to take a look at that, see where things are at. As you know, things are pretty straightforward in this class. It's just attendance. That's all that you're graded on. So I just wanted to remind you and let you know to check out the midterm grades, review the attendance grading scale in the syllabus so that you can see exactly how it works. As a reminder, say for example, if you've had 2 absences already and you have a B, in order to maintain that, you have to have no more absences, right? So the midterm grade is where you're at that point. To maintain it, you have to not have more absences. Of course, we have the policies on makeup work and documentation and all of that. So do that as needed. That's been working out well. I've been getting some good makeup assignments, so people are, the system is working. So let me know if you have questions about anything, but just wanted to remind you about that. You can review your attendance record in Brightspace, so you feel free to check that out in case you've lost track. It's right up there in the navigation bar. You can click on attendance and you will see where you're at. For some of the existing recordings, I know we've had some difficulty, and I apologize for the quality of the audio in some of the recordings. We have a new microphone wire, and we're troubleshooting and tweaking, and it's hopefully going to be getting better. We also have our grad assistants that are working on the closed captioning and improving it. So when I was testing them out, if you wear headphones, turn the volume up, and use the closed captioning, you can pretty much tell what's going on. But that's my advice if you're doing makeup assignments, and let me know if you are having trouble with understanding it, but it should be getting better and better, so that's the good news. Lastly, all email correspondence about the class, please put Art 200 in the subject line. That helps me not miss anything, so that is important as well. So, okay, that's it for housekeeping. Let me say that we would like to acknowledge the land on which the University at Buffalo operates, which is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty of Peace and Friendship, a pledge to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. It is also covered by the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua between the United States government and the Six Nations Confederacy, which further affirmed Haudenosaunee land rights and sovereignty in the state of New York. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague in printmaking, Noah Brewer, who is going to introduce Charlene Liu, tonight's visiting artist. So, thank you, Noah.
Very lucky indeed to have Charlene with us here tonight. We want to thank Becky Brown very much for her ongoing organizational effort as she puts forth week in and week out to manage this complicated endeavor that is Speaker Series. I also want to acknowledge the late UB Professor Harvey Breverman, who passed away earlier this semester. His endowment to our department provides the ongoing financial support, which makes it possible for us to bring a visiting print media artist such as Professor Liu here for a slightly more extended period of time. So in this case, Charlene will be here at the CFA with us all week, making printed work with our students. On a personal note, I met Charlene while I was in grad school at Columbia University. She had finished her MFA 4 years ahead of me and still lived nearby the school. When she left New York to take her current job at the University of Oregon, I moved into her studio. And then in 2016, just days after I had returned from a very important research trip of my own to the Czech Republic, I spent 10 days as an artist in residence Oregon, where I began the body of artwork which culminated just 2 weeks ago in a return to the Czech Republic for my first European solo show. So there's an emotional time of restraint there. Charlene has been a friend, a colleague, and mentor. Through our work, we speak a common language of prints, editions, and prinstallations. Now for the formal introduction. Born in Taiwan and raised in the American Midwest, Charlene Liu is an artist based in Oregon whose paintings, prints, and mixed media installations weave together traditional familial histories, local tropes, and decorative motifs to explore malleable conditions of memory, heritage, and identity. Her work draws freely from nature, food, ephemera, still life paintings, Rococo ornamentation, and East Asian art and design. Liu's luminous, layered compositions evoke multi-layered realities, fluid states, imaginative realms through material process, vibrant colors, and playful juxtapositions. Liu's work has been exhibited at the USC Pacific Asia Museum, Tacoma Art Museum, Shadow Institute of the Arts, the Schneider Museum of Art, and the Schnitzer Museum of Art at Portland State University. Liu is a 2024 Haley Ford Fellow in Visual Arts. She received her MFA in Visual Art from Columbia University and a BA from Brandeis. And Liu is a professor of art and printmaking at the University of Oregon. Please join me in welcoming Professor Charlene Liu.
All right, my turn, yeah. Let me, okay. Is this volume good? Great, all right. Thank you, Noah, for the introduction, and I want to thank Becky and Department of Art for the invitation and hosting my stay here. I've already had a great time meeting with some students today, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the week. Tonight, I'm going to talk about my recent work in printmaking, painting, and installation. And I think some of the themes or concepts that sort of bring all this work together is my interest in multiplicity and shifting perspectives and concepts of transformation. So I often use pattern, ornamentation, nature motifs, and I combine the concrete and familiar with the abstract. I'm starting out with, my name and where I am at, and this image of an installation I did recently. But before that, I'm going to move on to this next slide and talk a little bit about my biography, since some of the recent work is really informed by the biography of my childhood. And growing up in a Chinese-American family restaurant in a small strip mall in a very small town in Wisconsin. For many years, I think my work didn't really explicitly tap into family history, but in recent years, it's been really a focus of the way that I think about work and the way that I approach some of my projects. This is just a series of like four images, and you can sort of see the snow and the reflection there, and a very early state of the restaurant where it's still very minimalist, and it was called China Palace. And this is in the 80s, probably 80s, 90s, and early 2000. I did move here I was born in Kaohsiung, Taiwan, and I immigrated to the country when I was 4 to Wisconsin, where I grew up in the 80s and 90s. And I feel like that was a very formative years because we were essentially the only family, the only Chinese family, only immigrant family in town. And I think that's a very particular place or condition of living and growing up to become a part of a community, but also to be very isolated within your own family through language or through the difference in culture. Here's another image, and this is of myself, my sister, and my mother in the first restaurant that we ever opened in Wisconsin. And I think it was a restaurant that almost bankrupted the family because my parents were very young and very inexperienced. And I just want you to hold on to the image of the diagonal screen walls and the sign, China Garden. I also realized when I looked at this picture how young my mother was then. I think perhaps in her early 20s. And I think too about leaving, your home where you're so familiar, you know the language, and taking that really big leap and that adventure into a completely different place where you don't know the language, you don't know how anything works, and you don't really know how to make money. And I feel like that's a lot to tackle and take on, and also to raise a family at the same time. Here is an image of the restaurant in probably in the early 2000s, when over the years, this last restaurant we had, it became really like densely packed with like decor and objects, and really through the curation of my mother. So I think like this bar, she built into the corner, and she would buy things from the local garden store that were maybe fakes or knockoffs of things that look vaguely Asian, and also antique like Chinese bed headboard that she would strip, a Shanghai poster. So I really love this as an art piece in itself for its use of pastiche and bringing a whole bunch of objects together to create a particular mood and a setting. I wanted to I always thought that the restaurant itself became like this art project that maybe was the art project I wanted to do but didn't get to. So I decided to really, so it really was a bit of a compulsion for me. We liquidated a restaurant at some point because it was a failing business. It's a kind of model of running a business that no longer is very successful. And does it mean anything that your computer is flashing? Lights? No, okay, right. So I wanted to, when we liquidated a restaurant, I had my mother ship basically an entire container of objects to my home in Oregon at that time. And it really was on a whim. And she took me literally and sort of stripped some of the wood trim and the objects and the plastic lamps and that headboard, and a mirror. And she put it all in a moving pot, and it showed up in my driveway. And then I had to pay for storage and sit on all these objects. And I thought, oh no, like I have to make an art project out of this now. And that's what I did. And my first iteration of it was when I was invited to participate in the Portland Biennial in 2016 that was curated by Michelle Grabner. And she had a particular vision to place the artists that she invited into very unusual, non-traditional spaces all across the state of Oregon. So I was placed in Pendleton, Oregon, where I put together a show of prints in Crow's Shadow Institute of the Arts on the Umatilla Reservation. And that's a art center that was founded by Jim Labrador of the Walla Walla tribe and another indigenous artist. And it's a really amazing print shop, art center, and gallery space in this small town in a high desert of Eastern Oregon. And at the same time, I was given an opportunity to basically do whatever I wanted in this historic theater that had been completely gut renovated, and a small group of people was trying to fundraise to renovate the space. So this was a very unusual space in that it was actually quite unsafe, so no one could actually enter, but I could do some art piece in the lobby as an experiment. And I thought, why not? The stakes were low, and I thought I could, in the sense that they were letting me do whatever I wanted. And I could try a version of the restaurant project that had been sort of floating and brewing in my mind. And so I would say that the work, my first manifestation of this work really came about through pretty practical logistical constraints and site considerations around working in this space. And here is a view of the piece I put together called Shadow Palace. So I knew that we couldn't enter this space. I also wanted to be very portable. And I landed on the material of cardboard, which I laser cut in these different patterns. I really love the material of cardboard as the color of it was very dusky. It reminded me of twilight. It also really reminded me of the lighting of the restaurant, which is very dim and warm. I like the material as just a material that we actually box things up in, like objects and vases, and ship from one place to another. And everything could be designed in panels that could be flat pack and then put together on site. And because we couldn't enter the space, and because I knew the town was very small and just has the one main strip, Pendleton is a very, Eastern Oregon is a very, very unique place. It's a high desert, and Pendleton has the oldest roundup or rodeo in one of the oldest in the United States. I think when I went to install this piece, there was a Harley Davidson convention going on and like a town festival with, I don't know, dog racing, and the rodeo, everybody was gearing up for the rodeo. And it has the Umatilla tribe there and also the residents in Pendleton. And I really thought it was a great opportunity to think about this history of immigration in the West and to sort of bridge my family's history, immigration story, with a history of Chinese American immigrants and other immigrant groups and expansion out West. And that's sort of a history that's also really fraught with like violence, between the Exclusion Act and also the Japanese internment. And so that had a very strong interest to me to make that bridge. And because it's a space that you couldn't enter, I knew it had to be very visible, and that my best bet was to make it visible at night, so I made it into a mirror. The laser cut, here's another picture of one of my students standing in the bar. So this is a remake of the bar image that you saw. And the diagonal lines, I actually really thought of it as a reference to the rain in the Pacific Northwest, but then I found that photograph that I showed you earlier on and realized that looked exactly like the photograph of the first restaurant we ever opened up. And so I think there's something about coincidence, and maybe it was in my memory already. The image laser cut in the background is a very literal illustrative representation of the picture of the bar down to reflection. I brought a group of students with me. We did a practice run in the studio of putting it together, and then we all drove up to Pendleton and hung out in the town, and they helped me install the piece in 2 days. And we met everybody, and we met some very interesting characters actually in Pendleton, and that took us around. And we also went to visit Crow's Shadow, so it was kind of a beautiful experience overall with my students too. Here is the front of the space at daylight, and the cabinets on the side of display cases. I made risograph prints. Here's a close-up of the print, like a rainbow gradient, but it's also essentially a translation or copy of a pattern on a Chinese magic mirror. And these are very, very old, old bronze mirrors, and one side is very polished, like a mirror, but when you shine a light through it, it reveals a pattern. So a lot of my work talks about reflection, mirroring, veiling and unveiling, and like histories embedded in histories that unveils itself as you stand or shine a light through it in different ways and perspectives. And the aesthetics, it really stood out in this town, the color and the design and daylight. So that sort of gives you an idea of the first time I did my installation project, and I did think of it very much as a printmaker, and that the files are essentially, I could addition the piece if I wanted to, and so in that expanded sense, it's a print project. About the same time, I was making a lot of 4-color process screen prints on aluminum, and I'm going to show you just a sampling of 4 just to maybe highlight some of my interests. In this case, this is acrylic plexiglass that had been laser cut on a bronze pattern, and it's sitting on top of a remake of a French chinoiserie textile pattern. And I really thought about it as playing off of an object of art and design and thinking about export art and trade. Here's another one where I took that pattern and it sort of imprinted it on top of a scrap of oil marbled paper I had made in my studio. And I actually worked with a high-end custom car painting shop in town. So that I took my print end and they airbrushed using their urethane iridescent paint this pattern that I had given them on top of the panel. So it really became rather industrial and very glossy, and also more of somewhere between an object and a painting. And I like the transparency. Here's another piece, which is a much bigger 1-layer screen print that combines a lot of the motifs that I've been working on. And maybe one thing I could point out here is I actually do use a lot of digital tools, both Photoshop and Illustrator, and I sort of design these different components that could be put together in different ways. This is sort of the vessel, the mist, the morning rain. This is just the Pacific Northwest and the misty, rainy quality. And I really like the mood that this painting made. Here's another one, Cascade screen print and acrylic paint in aluminum with a wood ledge. And here I was playing around with painting as an object and display. And then I'm going to swing back to a couple of photographs of the restaurant kind of later on, and this gives you a sense of how dense it became. So this region of Wisconsin also has a very strong German-American Scandinavian influence, and I feel like the restaurant sort of reflected that, both in its cuisine and in the decor. When you go look closely at the objects that sit next to each other, I really was thinking about, not about assimilation so much as I was thinking about acculturation. You know, when you move into a place and you sort of take on like a culture that's sort of different from yourself. So in that sense, I'm thinking about cultural hybridity and about maybe being like Chinese American in the Midwest in a way. Here is just a close-up of, okay, so like that image of the women on the, I guess it's like your right, my left, looking this way, is in a bathroom. And that wallpaper was left over from whatever restaurant used to be there, and it's all these sort of, I don't know, they're like flapper women or something, or women from the 30s and 40s, and I really like the wallpaper, even though I was, even at a young age, kind of mildly offended by it. And then my mother would put this very Chinese, you know, looking piece on top of it. And I feel that there's both like a real sincerity and a real humor in that kind of juxtaposition in a restaurant that really just speaks to this, this place. So fast forward 6 years later to 2024, because now this is sometimes how long it takes to bring an art project into fruition, into its next stage. When I did the Portland Biennial in 2016, I had invited a art historian, Jenny Lin, who specialized in contemporary Chinese art and fashion, to do an interview with me, and that went into the catalog. So 6-7 years later, she had been still thinking about some of the ideas that we had discussed around this idea of material transfer, around maybe taking personal stories and making connections to like larger, more global histories, around ideas of immigration and family narratives. And she proposed and invited me to be in a show called Another Beautiful Country, Moving Images by Chinese American Artists at the USC Pacific Asia Museum. And the Pacific Asia Museum itself is already in this odd little like historic building in the style of a particular kind of Chinese architecture. And she had invited a group of artists, Chinese American artists, Patty Chang, Andrew Huang, who in our different ways, we told stories about, you know, like transnational like identities or family narratives, immigration. And it was a really kind of amazing show to be asked to be a part of. And I had the opportunity to really expand on the installation project I started in Portland Biennial, but this time I thought I was gonna fold in all the objects that I had sitting in the storage unit and try to remake the restaurant without feeling like I was on my way to opening a restaurant, which is actually, most of the time I started thinking, am I opening up a Chinese restaurant? Because it was like so much detail that went into this piece. So this is some close-ups, and I'm gonna cycle through these images. So all these objects were vases and objects that my mother had collected and displayed in an original restaurant. The Chinese food sign hung up in the window of the restaurant. The welcome sign was like made by a friend. It was very, very Wisconsin country craft looking with a little doll. And I made paper flowers out of printed material because flowers was a recurring theme, a way that my mother decorated a space. And here's a larger installation shot. The walls of the gallery were painted, the walls of the color of the restaurant in my memory and in the photographs. Some of the tables, the tablecloths are from the restaurant, and the chairs. So I really try to set a particular mood that was quite accurate to my memory and my feelings about the space. Here's, it's had a front and a back space. I thought about the installation as an unfolding book in which it contained the objects and prints that told a history about the restaurant. And here are just some of the restaurant itself was very long, had all these like corridors and hallways, and I was trying to get that sense or that feeling of the piece. It was quite a little difficult to document, but I think it was more a piece that you navigate your way through. The concept, Another Beautiful Country, is also a play on ABC, American Born Chinese, and the idea of moving images for the curator, it both refer to moving images, artists that might work in video, but also to the state, an emotional state, something that moves you emotionally. And so this is what the curator was thinking about when she put together the show. And I thought that was like a really beautiful way to sort of be expansive and inclusive around this idea. Here are some close-up details. If you'll see that pattern in the drop ceiling, that's a pretty literal translation of the phoenix and dragon, really fake plastic tiles that was in the restaurant. Because the restaurant, again, the original restaurant was in a strip mall. So everything was built up through facades and layers. And in some sense, the restaurant itself and this installation, I thought of it as setting a scene, like almost like a set design where props and lighting and objects are used to really communicate information or to set a mood and to share a story. The restaurant played a lot with ideas of the Far East, what represents it. And I think that this idea of like cliches and tropes of the Far East was something that really caught my imagination. So even though it sort of plays around with this idea of like what is the Far East, like San Francisco, Chinatown, it's also, I want to say, a very accurate, impressionistic remaking of my memory and my relationship to the restaurant that I grew up in. And it was also a place of business where people gathered together and ate food and dined and brought their families to celebrate birthdays and graduations. Here's another close-up. There's a God statue that hung up, that sat in the kitchen of the restaurant for like 20 years, and they put it in an installation. There was a lot of Christmas, it's Wisconsin, so there's like Christmas decorations everywhere. The pattern in this laser cut cardboard is just snowflakes on a window pane. And I also had a lot of printed ephemera cutouts, clippings from old newspaper ads that we used to run in the local newspaper of buffets and Mother's Day buffets or restaurant ads. And I remade those in a print and also put some, played around with text that I pulled from the menu. And this is just another way through print to really share a little bit about the history. I don't have a close-up here, but I'll have a close-up later. And I do think you can tell a lot about the history of a place through food. There's another scene. And here's a wall of all the weird mishmash of thrift store finds and other things that have been collected by my family and displayed in a restaurant. So again, like the restaurant is sort of displaying all these objects together. I made paper flowers out of printed materials, so the flowers itself had embedded content in it. And then maybe I'll share a story about this image, which is, it tells a little story within a story, because this still life image, this still life was put together by a local artist in Wisconsin that was the mother of my mother's friend. And she was a housewife, if you will, but also a painter, and maybe one might say a hobby painter, a Sunday painter, but really actually quite committed to her practice of painting across her lifetime. And she made this beautiful oil painting out of these still life objects, and she gifted my mother the painting and gifted my mother the vase and the doll. And for many years, this, exactly as I showed in this installation, this is how it sat in the restaurant in different configurations: the painting, the doll, the vase of flowers, the painting, the doll, the vase of flower on a pedestal. And so I basically just recreated that in the installation too. And this is a little hard decipher, but there's a freestanding screen or sculpture that has a mirror in it, so it creates this corner that you can stand in. And I did not meant to make a selfie corner, but a lot of people stood there and would take a selfie of themselves with the sculpture, the painting, their own reflection in this space. And again, here are just ideas about reflecting, mirroring, shifting perspective, and maybe this idea of a space that is ungrounded. So you're never quite sure, foreground, background, middle ground, these things can like shift and slide. And I really think of that as a metaphor analogy to culture, to identity. I think a lot about how quickly actually you can lose, what defines you, what defines your identity, and I think how quickly you can lose all of these like cultural like, or heritage, like rituals and markers. Like I barely know how to speak Chinese at this point or read or write it. I don't know really how to cook, but I do feel very much, a Chinese American, and I feel very comfortable when I also hang out with a family and maybe go back to Asia. So this is very interesting to me, and I want to tell the story and have these connections with an audience through my work. Here are some photographs of the restaurant that I remade in a photolitho and included in the installation. The pattern of the laser cut trim that you see here is also a carved wood trim that came out of the restaurant, and it really is like German scroll work, which is, the German-American influence is very strong in the region because a lot of German immigrants settled there. On the back wall, I had a series of 4-color separation screen prints, 4-color process screen prints, CMYK screen prints, and these are of the qipao, a traditional Chinese dress that's made out of silk with a very high tight collar. And they are the dresses of my mother that she had kept, and the dresses of the curator's mother that had been custom made for her too. I took these dresses, took very high resolution photographs of the work, and made these digital collages, playing around with like flipping and reversing and referencing the figure without always fully, making a representational work. And then I'm going to show you one process photo for those of you that aren't very clear about the process. But this is, you can take a color photograph and break it down into yellow, magenta, cyan, black. You print them on top of each other, and it creates a full color image with tonal, a tonal range. I feel like the medium actually spoke a lot to the content of the work for me because it is a halftone, and a halftone is made up of varying densities of dot sizes and dot densities. So in some ways, it basically tricks your eye into seeing a range of values and creating a photographic image. And if you really zoom in close, it sort of breaks down into these dots. I felt that it was really akin to this experience of memory or looking at a photograph. When you look at an old family photograph and you're trying to like understand like your past or where you might come from, and the more you look, maybe the less you can figure anything out, and everything sort of falls apart. And I like that medium of the halftone and 4-color process as a way to speak to some of the ideas in the work. Here's a close-up. And this one actually does maybe have a figure in it. It does. It was modeled. It was a dress, and I kind of hid it in the pattern. I really enjoyed working with the curator here because I feel like there was a personal level and a connection where I also used her family's dress and made a connection to her history too. And here is another one. I think we're doing pretty well on time, right? Okay, good. Here's a close-up of a Mother's Day buffet ad that we ran in the local paper. I think the price probably dates it a little bit. $7.95 and $5.50 for an all-you-can-eat buffet is a pretty good deal. And I think you can also tell a lot in the listing of the dishes. You'll see that it says Friday night seafood buffet and Saturday night prime rib and seafood buffet. For those of you that might be from the Midwest, Wisconsin has a tradition of the supper club. And the supper club, I mean, it's hard to describe what a supper club is, but it is sort of known for its a particular kind of menu, prime rib and seafood buffet, and people would go out and socialize and eat at a supper club every night, and would have like brandy old fashions, eat prime rib and seafood, and maybe have live music and dance. And so we didn't really, as a Chinese restaurant, we didn't really fall into the supper club tradition. But on the other hand, actually, a lot of our food sort of adapted and took on a lot of the supper club tradition, because we ran the buffets, and we would also, for a number of years, we would have the live music at night where people would come and drink and eat food and dance, very much in the Wisconsin supper club tradition. And I have very fond memories of that space. And I think also another way to speak to that kind of, when two things come together, around this idea of hybridity and cultural hybridity, and sort of creating a new life for yourself as an immigrant. So at the same time as I did a show down in Pacific Asia Museum, I was invited by Alexander Terry, who is a curator currently at the New Mexico Museum of Art, to participate in the show called Labor of Love. And this show, the premise of this show was that she wanted to work with artists that sort of in their work highlighted unseen or more invisible labor, and to make it visible. And so I thought of this because it ran concurrently to the installation work down at Pacific Asia Museum as an extension of the installation. So I titled the same, but with a focus on prints. And I also painted the same color and made a little wall using the same trim. But I did have an opportunity to be more explicit about a narrative and to work more with the photographic images. And this is a picture of my mother in her 20s cooking in the kitchen. Maybe she's in her 30s, looks very young. Cooking in the kitchen of the restaurant, and a Mother's Day buffet ad and a dress pattern. So I brought it all together. I made some paper flowers and garlands, and I wanted to be, I guess, a little celebratory. But when I was installing it, I called her up and she told me it looked funerary. And so I had to change up the color and modify a little bit, because she didn't like that. And then I had a moment where I thought, oh yeah, the celebratory and the funerary. I mean, there's a lot of like flowers and garlands and memorial. But this one was sort of a picture of her in the restaurant in America. And this one is a picture of her, almost like a film strip made in photogravure, which is her in Taiwan. So in some ways, this is very much of a straightforward timeline of her immigration story across the wall. And here is a large print where I just extracted some of the words from the menu. I didn't really have a lot of logic. I just didn't want to write a poem, but I wanted to use some of the text from the menu, and maybe play around with some of the words that really reminds me of the restaurant. Carryouts, hot and sour soup, snow peas because I had to do a lot of chores in the restaurant. And so I had all these, again, here's another wall with a menu, and hot and sour snow peas. They function as signage, and they function for myself as choosing words that maybe had a double meaning. Like snow reminds me of snow in Wisconsin. Snow peas also is just a ingredient, a vegetable that you might see in a Chinese dish. And snow peas is also, again, like peeling shrimp and cutting off the tips of snow peas is a chore that I had to perform a lot as a child or a teen working in a restaurant. And then here is a print with paper garlands. Here's a close-up. The flower prints I made. Both these shows were important to me in that I was excited to really be invited to work with curators, but also to work in a museum that expanded the possibility of audience for me. Pacific Asia Museum is located in Pasadena in California, and in that area there are many large groups of immigrants that have settled there. It is completely different from the story of my family living in isolation in Wisconsin. I really wanted to have that shift of that relationship and making work around my story in California, where there are large, immigrant Asian populations, and to be able to connect with an audience, an intergenerational audience, through the work. And I think that really did happen because both museums are academic museums, and they do a lot of programming that serves the communities in the region. And so they bring in like children, like grandparents and parents, and a real range of audience. And some that might not necessarily step into a museum to look at art, but that might come in to do a workshop or to have an event. And that, to me, had a lot of meaning in my desire to really make different connections with a wider audience. The Portland University, the JSMA at Portland State, they are also located in urban centers, so their foot traffic of students and people in the community is very, very high, and they do a lot of programming in the museum to really connect people together. And sometimes it's not explicitly about my art, but they might do a storytelling event with children in front of my work. And I feel like this is sort of the power of art and the power of an audience, and something that I really want to explore in my work that I hadn't done so clearly before. I'm going to show you a couple images of why I really love printmaking, because you can try different print forms. I made a book for a show that a friend put together. And I basically made a mini version of the restaurant installation in book form, so you could fold it up and put it on your shelf. I used old prints that actually already had for another edition that had a pattern that I was playing around with. And I took the files I used to make the laser cut cardboard for the restaurant installation, and I made some changes because that shift in scale, you have to make some changes, and cut the pattern into the prints, and did I guess you would call it I'm not sure, like a double stitch accordion bind. So it's like not one accordion, but it's two accordions coming together. Created little rooms in its book form, and the cover is made out of cardboard and a photo flat, and I sewed it with a red thread. And I actually quite like this. I would think about editing this because it's a way to make a little restaurant for people to take. I also made this risograph print as a takeaway print, and I think that this is something I also hadn't explored so much as a printmaker, but there's a really strong tradition of independent publishing, making prints, and making high multiples that you can sort of give away. I thought it was a perfect format to share a story, and this is a very clear story. On one side is my youthful parents in Kaohsiung, Taiwan, and the other side is the move to Wisconsin, and superimposes an old ad, a photograph of the restaurant, and a pattern. This event was a celebratory event, again, a year before I did installation at a museum down in California, where we were doing a sort of an Asian night or Chinese Taipei night celebration, where we had food, music. There was a filmmaker that was also invited, and we helped facilitate a 1-minute filmmaking workshop with the audience using their iPhone so that they could put together a story about their family and perhaps about their immigration story. And at the same time, at the end of the night, they could take away a piece they could take away a print. And so that was really exciting to me as another way to, I guess, give art away, but really to tell a story. So this really sort of concludes maybe in some ways the work and installation that I put together this year, which started in 2016. And I'm gonna move into my printmaking work and also my painting work that really, again, shares some of the themes around multiplicity about shifting like space. I do design blocks that are modular and can be configured in different ways. A lot of the motifs come out of looking at fashion and art and design, like cultural objects of art and design. A lot of East Asian art. I will redraw them and I'll reduce them down to very basic and elemental forms. And then I improvise on a press. So there is no set plan, but I'll go in with these set of blocks and I will sort of define a color palette. And sometimes the palette might reference the original object, but sometimes it's just looking at everyday objects because you really notice color trends. And we nickname every color. This is one of my assistants that was working with me. We call this millennial pink because for some reason this pink was like everywhere. And we would mix this color. My student showed up one day with that hair color and I made her sit in front of the print because I couldn't have planned it better for her to have dyed her hair like one of my prints. And here are these modular blocks I designed to act like gold chains. So what I really like here is the idea of improvising, working improvisationally, but working with a set of constraints. The grid, the mechanical printing press, and a very limited set of blocks, but blocks that are modular, so they can be reconfigured in different ways. It's sort of a challenge because sometimes I get really tired or bored and I think, oh my God, like how many prints can I possibly make with like flowers and circles and like little squiggles? But then it gets very exciting. So it's not unlike maybe playing music, like improvising on music. Sometimes I'll take these blocks and think about charms and bracelets. Sometimes I think about landscape. So this is maybe like landscape, a garden or a swamp. Here's another like blooming gardens. But these are all sort of the same block in different palettes and different configurations. I thought about this as a face because the fun thing is sometimes the blocks can come together and I can make it look like a caterpillar. Sometimes I put together and it looks like a flower. I mean, whatever I feel like playing around with is sort of the fun part of woodcut for me. And then here at some point, I don't really plan anything, so sometimes I'm surprised by what happened. Like I layered these blocks together and it made these eyes that kept staring at me and it looks like a pattern of a bug. So I went with that. I thought of these as little bugs in the garden. And then here's just an installation shot of two prints. They're somewhat large. I do a lot of paper making. Basically, I love printmaking because I can generate a lot of material and then make a lot of paintings and prints by collage. Etchings on Gampi paper, handmade paper forms that I can put together into a painting. This is, I don't know why I was like fascinated by anime hair for a while. So I was like making swirly anime hair. And I was thinking about hair, actually, my own hair shedding on the ground and swirling around. But it's also sort of like a landscape or a tide pool. I made this piece too when I thought about it as a gust of wind, a tide pool in Oregon, blossoms, little animals, or hair pieces, wigs floating across the landscape. Here's a close-up. So the fun thing about paper casting is you can spring life into a shape and you don't cut it. I'm going to show you some pictures of working with a fine art publisher, a print shop, a professional print shop. And I normally work in my own print shop with student assistants, but 2 years ago I started working with Maloney Printing Company up in Portland. This place is founded by Paul Maloney, and they do work with artists and do fine art publishing. They specialize in chinkole, traditional chinkole, and also photogravure. So they helped me make some of the prints that you saw in this lecture. Harry Schneider is a former student of mine, and he is now co-partner and co-owner in this print shop, which is how I made the connection. And they invited me up there to see if I could work together with them. And it turned out to be pretty fantastic. if anything, for a couple reasons. One, because I can work really quickly. So I'll do prep work, but when I go up to print, I'll spend kind of like this Breverman residency I'm going to do. I spend like 3 to 5 days in a print shop, and we generate a lot of work, with a team in those 5 days. And so it allows me to really experiment and do a range of work. They specialize in chicolé, so I can do a lot of collage, and I can do large-scale collage. And they also have an offset press, which does things that my direct pressure press can't do, because it can lay in really thin layers of color and pull out the wood grain in a really incredibly beautiful way. And so this is just sort of a close-up of the wood grain and a layering of transparent colors on top of each other. And here's Alejandra, who was there, started as an intern and then became an employee, but she's now doing a fellowship residency at Dieudonné in New York, which is very well known for papermaking and papermaking artwork. So for those of you that are, you should look into that, because you can apply to intern at Dieudonné and you can apply for fellowships there. And Harry, that's Harry, my former student that went to PNCA at grad school and now is co-owner in his shop. And then Paul there, working on some works. I have a lot of unfinished work in their shop right now, so I have to return there. Okay, now I'm going to get into painting, and I think timing is still okay, but I'll move a little faster. This is my first foray into public art, and I thought it'd be interesting to talk about for all the artists out there, because public art is, I don't know if I'm going to do another public art piece soon, but I do think it's an interesting way to work as an artist, because when you propose a public art piece, you have a very defined budget. So your material budget, your fabrication budget, your design budget is there. You make decent money. And you also have an audience that's really built in, because it's essentially a public art collection. It's permanent to the building. A lot of buildings and state buildings, state-funded buildings, for instance, will set aside a 1% for the artist, another term that you might know. And with that, they will put a call out for public art and select artists. A lot of airport art you see is a public art commission. And so I had proposed one for the new residence and dining hall at University of Oregon, a very, very new, like, fancy food court and dining hall. And I thought it was actually quite appropriate for my work because of my interest in the restaurants and food and in dining and in landscape. And this is a set of woodcuts I made with a hand-painted motif on the wall. And this is just playing around with a mooncake motif, a cake motif, and the idea of a moon. But the central part of this public art piece was 5'7" by, I can't remember, they were giant paintings that I made for the hall. And when you do public art work, you really have to work with the contractors and design team and the site and the timeline of the site. And I thought it was both very limiting in a particular way, but also gave me a lot of freedom in the end, because I think I engaged something in my work that I don't normally do, which is it was very graphic, and in some ways it became very specific. It's in a food court, in a dining hall. I wanted to make work that shared something about my Chinese heritage, but also talked about food. And the wall was very big. It's maybe 30 some feet high and 40 feet long. And I also know the students, I wanted to blend into space, but if you sat there and look at it, that it would have some sort of visual interest. And I didn't really want to get into the particulars of thinking about lighting and the lighting in the space. Where I'm standing to take a photograph is an entire bank of windows and doors. So the conditions of light changed, and I think it was south-facing, so the conditions of light really changed. There's a clear story where the ceiling opens up, and it's a clear story running along the entire bank. So some of the things I thought about was I knew the paintings would be best if it was very graphic, and that the color had to emanate its own light so that it can kind of hold itself in a space from 24/7. It's very, very visible at night because it's very dark outside and they keep the lights on. And it also has a lot of cast shadows and reflections in the day. And I think it was actually quite successful because really for the color and the pattern. This is Hot Pot. Hot Pot is a communal dining experience where you have plates of food and you cook it in a hot broth. And it could be like a 3-hour-long affair, and sometimes you, in the States, you might do it around like celebration time. And it's pretty graphic. I did think it was kind of funny to play around with like food court signage. You know, it was around the corner, but also like painting, like, you know, like large-scale painting. Here's another, I'm just gonna show you 3. Here's another one that is not the vegetables, but it is actually a repeat pattern that it designed. I mean, the pattern barely makes sense, but it really works. And I like how bold and fun it is, just like waves and soup and little vegetables bobbing around in it. And then here this is called Gift because it's a mooncake. But mooncake sort of made into a container that kind of shifts and turns into a landscape. I used a lot of gradients, very bold colors. I think across the 5 paintings, there was probably like over 200 some different colors that were used. And here is a picture that was on a poster of working in the studio. I did make these paintings very much like a printmaker. Lots of registration, stenciling. I did design it. I would draw by hand, lots of sketches, but I did design them in Illustrator. And then I would transfer the main elements of painting in a very, essentially almost like a Renaissance cartoon technique where you dust charcoal or through like holes, but a new version of it using digital tools, but a very, very old technique to translate, like fresco painting where you might ponce your drawing onto a wall. This is my student. Well, he was not a student at this time, but had been a student of mine. And I hired him to help me out with this project because after graduation, he had been working in large-scale mural painting for Nike and had really gained a lot of experience working in scale and in color and doing large mural paintings. So I knew that he could do the work without training, and we had a very, very strict timeline to adhere to. And we moved fast. And here's like, this is my one video because I feel like this find this very satisfying. It shows you, like this is a vinyl stencil. I did kind of miscalculate my timing. And it turned out that this is kind of complicated, but you have to sort of negotiate with inspection and contractors. And I thought I had a week to go, but then a series of events happened with inspection, you know, fire inspection and furniture inspection, where I only ended up having a 24-hour window to install the work with the contractors before they bolted down the furniture and had it inspected. And if I hadn't made that window, then it would mean a miscalculation in my budget because then I would have to hire the lift equipment because the wall was so big and I would have to hire my own team to install. And so at the end, we moved really fast and I actually finished. I decided for some reason at last minute I had to put in these stripes. And so while I had 2 assistants helping me pack up the painting, I was still painting. And then someone came with a truck and we got it there in time for the contractors to install it, which was way more affordable because for liability issues, like I can't borrow the equipment. I would have had to go out and rent the equipment and hire my own team. And then the next day, they bolted down the furniture and they did an inspection. So this is sort of what happens in this is actually quite easy for public art because I proposed something that didn't require major engineering. But even then ahead of time, before I even started a project, I did have to decide where I needed wall reinforcements to happen and communicate that to the contractors so that they could put in the wall reinforcement. And because of budget issues and just because it didn't make sense, you know, there's only, maybe I had like I kind of allowed myself a 5-inch room of error. of how I could shift it this way, up and down, or sideways. So a lot of it is some design work and planning with the floor plans ahead of time and the schematic drawings. I really felt excited by the public art project at the end because I think I worked in a way with color and with imagery I hadn't done before. And so I started a series of paintings of which I'm just going to show two to end the lecture. And that really took what I explored in the public art piece and played around again with food, heritage, and just color and being very playful. I wanted to merge landscape and food, interior and exterior spaces together, and I also wanted to continue to play with like the way I work things digitally and then also paint by hand. So this is, if you can't tell, I did compose this in a 3D software. I'm very bad at it, but I didn't matter. I just wanted to get something out, and I like how seductive like 3D rendering is, but I also like the seduction of like a really large painting. And I thought those two traditions combined together would be interesting. This is very simple. It's like swirling cake, swirling candy oranges, and swirling boba pearls. And so it's like a little confection or a sweet that also looks like a, I actually gave this a very short version of a lecture for a Asian American Pacific Islander group, affinity group of kindergartners, first and second grades. And they were very delightful because they saw so many things in this painting. One saw a duck, and I thought, yeah, I could see the duck. and others really recognized the boba. So I thought this was pretty fun. And even a pattern was created in that software program. And then I made this painting, which is very, very electric. And part of it, the challenge, was to really smush together, merge together a waterfall, a bowl of soup, a soup spoon, and an interior scape and a landscape, and to maybe convey this feeling of like soup cascading down into your belly, or like this cascade of a waterfall in the landscape of Oregon. And I also just wanted to use like really like hot colors I would never think about putting together in a painting, but it worked. And I also was thinking a lot about, and this I think is something I do in all of my work, about that vibration between something being very graphic and being very indistinct at the same time. So the edges are a little bit fuzzy, and but it's also very graphic at the same time. And I feel like you can really communicate that through color and through like that line, that the way that you treat the edge or the shape of things. And I also just really think I started doing something I hadn't done in my work before, is that, I don't know, why can't I have a soup spoon like floating in the sky? I mean, it's really silly, but I think it works. And so abstraction, that, I think I mentioned this before, this blend or this balance between something that's very concrete and quite literal with the very abstract. I think what I'm not going to cover, though, is my watercolors and pastel work, which I often do in plein air, and that is where my love of the landscape comes from. I'm going to end with this image, which shows you a glimpse of work that I'm doing now, where I am taking the vases, but recasting them, remaking them in paper casting. So working with handmade paper and paper pulp, because in the end, I wasn't entirely certain how I felt about incorporating the actual objects in a restaurant installation, because I think in the end, as an artist, I'm actually quite interested in translation and material transfer, and how through that you can really talk about transformation and talk about, and just be very playful through material and through process. And so I'm just experimenting with making these vases and decorating them and having a range of them, because in my mind, I'm going to have an installation of these vases and sort of remove some of the narrative and maybe explore more about emotion in the landscape. And I left you my website and my Instagram, which I'm not on often, but sometimes I put down process videos in there. Because my students just taught me how to do a reel, so I'm like getting better at it. And you can see some of the paper making there. All right. I think I kept it under time, and I'm going to open up for any questions you might want to ask me. Thank you. Do I stay up here for questions? Or I can stand, or I can sit? Or I could walk. I'm going to walk down here.
Questions for
Yeah.
Charlene? Raise your hand. Who wants to start it off?
Any tips for art leaders that are graduating and then wanting to do something almost like self-fulfilling in a way that's not for a company or somebody? And if so, what would be like your tips for them to stay afloat and balance, kind of like balance what they want to do, but also not worry about like money?
Oh, well, I mean, I feel like everything is anecdotal, and I'm only going to base it on my own experience. But I mean, I give the advice of don't be afraid to work. I had a lot of jobs after graduation. I mean, I was like I worked for a pharmaceutical company. I did some weird handwriting analysis like gig. I've worked in a factory before, and I think that every job I had, I really gained a lot of experience in being organized and communicating with people, and also in being able to maintain my practice on the side. But I also really want to give you advice to continue to look at art and to maybe explore, because you're relatively, maybe you have a little bit more freedom after you graduate, so you might want to think about going abroad or looking at residencies and applying for a residency that might take you to a different country and meeting other artists. I feel like that's the way that you could still hold on to your work and be balanced, and also gain some work experience. Yeah. There was another hand somewhere here. You want to ask? Yes.
Are you inspired by any particular artist when it comes to your installation work?
Well, I mean, I'm inspired by a lot of artists. For my installation work, let me think about this. Well, I actually was quite inspired by some of the artists I showed with in Pacific Asia Museum. I don't know if you noticed artist Candice Lin, who makes kind of it's very different from my work, but I really love their work because she made this, I know this is going to sound really weird when I describe, lithium demon sex god. So it was really about like factory work, and it was also sort of this myth about a lithium sex god, and it also had these urns and these like strange apparatus in a video. So I feel that I think the work is she works in installations, so the work is way more experimental out there than mine, so I really love that. And also De Husso, I really like the work there around memory and space. I don't know about installation, but I do love Patty Chang's work as another artist that talks about maybe family, memory, body. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm not so so strongly in anime, but I do really love Nausicaa, Valley of the Wind, and Miyazaki movies. I particularly love the graphic novels, the Nausicaa, Valley of the Wind. They were all like black and white pen drawings, because I think that it touches upon so many things about war and ecological disaster, but sort of like a new world order where nature, and I find that narrative really interesting, but I also find the astounding number of drawings that's in that graphic novel to be very inspiring. But maybe those hair, I'm embarrassed to tell you what anime I was looking at for the hair, but it was very, It was a very old one, like, oh my God, is there something? I was very, very fascinated by the rendering of this kind of representation of young women. Mm-hmm. Anything else? You can ask me. And I think one thing I didn't talk about there is that maybe it goes back to your question earlier around professional practice, is that a lot of the installation work, it involves grant writing to fund it. So that is how, because the logistics of putting that together and taking it down to a museum, even with the funding from the museum, and in the case of the curator, a Warhol grant, I also applied and received grants on my end to do the work. And I think it was like a month just to inventory and create those pieces. So it becomes very complicated, which is why sometimes I actually just like to make paintings. It's easier. Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I think I know I talked about audience and connecting with a wider audience, but in some ways, when I made a piece, I feel like I only made a piece for 3 people, and my mother did see it, and I would, if she lived here, I think I would have been open to more collaboration. She had a lot of opinions. Like I got a critique from her. And I think like all critiques, there are moments where it's very hard to take it. But we had a very beautiful opening where my family came, and we had an opening at the Pacific Asia Museum, and it was quite a celebration. So they were there with me, and I think the reason I feel like in some ways the piece is for them, because it's hard to tell, but unless you know the restaurant, but there are moments in the installation that is very familiar to them. They knew exactly what I was referencing, down to the wall, which I think could only be their experience. But in terms of a wider audience, I had really, really great conversations around, other people that had narratives around their family immigration stories. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Okay. Yeah. Mm. So we didn't really bring a lot, but that's partly why I included the cheap-out dress pieces, and that's why the curator wanted them there, because if there was anything that was brought over that was sort of, you could almost say like an heirloom, because sometimes they're passed down to the family, would have been the dresses. And everything else was sort of acquired in the course of like running this business. And maybe one thing that we could use as a reference point in some ways is sort of the history of San Francisco Chinatown, because that has a particular kind of, in some ways it sort of sets the stage for what it means to represent, like an East Asian space in the U.S., right, down to the architecture and sort of in their kind of mix of like business and social groups. And I feel that to me was always also an interesting thing to think about in the trajectory of my family and being so isolated and so dislocated, but then sort of referring back, not really, I feel like in some ways not so much back to like Taiwan or anything, but actually maybe to Chinatowns in the US. And so and to me in that case, and also because it's a place of business, so you're like selling a product, you're selling Chinese food to in a community that isn't very familiar with it. And so that play of the exotic is fascinating to me, but maybe when I was younger, I had more of a critical stance, to how I think about it. But later on in life, I think there's something very direct and sincere in it. And I think, I'm losing my voice. So that, let me get my glass of water. And pastiche is very, very fascinating to me because it's, sometimes I think about collage and printmaking, how everything sort of comes together into one picture plane, and it really becomes like a singular image or object again, like you can make a new image out of like appropriation or collage. But in pastiche, I always think about how it sort of like refers back to these different like styles and these different kinds of like tropes, and they sort of like fit together, and that really is how I think about the restaurant. So there's lots of German-American things in there too. Good, I mean, there's a lot of glass going. I'll answer in whatever you want.
So you stated that there was like an image that you found almost offensive when you were younger.
Oh, like which one is it?
That you grew up becoming an artist.
Oh my, I feel like I'm offended by more images now. Like, as I get older. Okay, which image did I say that for? Oh, yeah, because maybe that's a lie. Maybe I was offended in my older age, because I don't know. I think when I was younger, because actually the image, it bears the breast, and in a very conservative society of like the Midwest, that seemed like, oh my God, why is this in the bathroom? But then as I got older, so there's something interesting because it's actually not in the public space. It's in the there's always like at University of Oregon, actually all our bathrooms are like not so gendered anymore, and this is like sort of like, the men's room and a women's room. And so actually the men's room had a wallpaper of, I think, like baseball, like, people playing baseball. And then the women's bathroom had a woman in undress, like halfway dressed. And I think that split maybe didn't sit so well with me. And now that I'm talking about it, yeah, it still doesn't sit well with me. But then again, it's a very intimate, private space in that space too, and it's not really in a public place. I'm trying not to do that. I'm trying not to do like old and offended by everything. But mainly, it was like when I went to the Asian Museum I was talking about earlier, and I'm looking at all the French paintings, which I still really love, the Impressionist paintings, but the Gauguin's paintings are really hard for me to look at. And I think in a way that was so apparent to me when I was younger, but now it's just underage, my viewers on there is painting, that's the best. Okay, there's another question. Oh, there was one.
So you had talked about how you would go and work for 5, 6, 7 days at a time and crank out a ton of work. I'm curious about the selection process at the end of that, or how the process was as you made. Can you just talk about that a little bit more? I'm just curious, like, after all of that, are you content with, however many pieces, or do you choose a very few?
I am very honestly often dissatisfied, and I do think that probably is sort of what drives my art making. Some of it is really easy because I try something within that space and it just doesn't work out. And sometimes I put together an image and the image just doesn't really sit well with me, or maybe it became a little bit too legible or illegible in different ways. Printmaking is also very technical, but you can generate a lot of multiples. And then in the end, honestly, it could have been edited or put together in different ways. But I do think, there's that one ground print with the gardens hanging
not really sure how I felt about it, but what I did like about it was that I tried something different. Because I was trying to bring two aspects of my practice together I hadn't done before in imagemaking. And I really wanted to see it on the wall and to present it publicly. And just no matter how I felt about it, like my unease or my sense of failure, I felt that it gave me enough that I would put it up there. And then I'll share this story, but when I was installing the work, I was at a very short timeline just because of childcare issues and had to do that. And I got very tired of it and it didn't put me very on. And I just made a decision at the end. The curator actually called me and was like, what are you doing? I had this moment where, I went back and I felt that conversation we had was valid. And so I found it in me to go back a week later and make this change at the end. And I don't know I would do it for everybody, but I really love the composition of this particular person. And so a little bit of a chance, a little bit of frustration, a little bit of like just possibility of work with up on the wall. What I'm trying to avoid now is having so few work that I can't edit. I would rather have more work than not enough work and feeling like I was there forever. And I think that was maybe more of my approach when I was like earlier on in my career. And now I'm trying to do the opposite where I have options. And the hard work isn't that editing, where I have to make a decision not to work. Good question.